These weeks are flying by now. We've got zombies done, direwolves and fellbats done, and this week we're going to look at some of the more elite units. Let's get into it after this. Hi folk, welcome back, I'm Wayne, and as you know, if you've been following along, you'll have seen we're working on this Soulblight Gravelord army, and we're going to try and get it done before the end of the year. I've loved these units, I've really enjoyed painting them, and it's given me a new love for vampires in Warhammer, which is something that I'd never really been into up until Curse City. In this episode, we're going to look at bloodknights. But before we do, just let me ask you, if you're enjoying this series and you've seen some of the previous episodes, thank you very much. If you're not, please do subscribe if you like this sort of content. It's not going to be all series, but certainly as we get this army ready to field, we're just going to crack on and get through the next few videos until we've got this army done before the end of the year, hopefully. Playlist up here. Do subscribe, as I say. It is much appreciated. And if you have already, thank you very much. Bloodknights are what we're going to look at this week. I'm not going to lie, I've not been looking forward to painting these units. I think they're overly detailed and they're very spiky and quite painful to put together. In fact, I've bled a couple of times, which is, well, vampires. Joking aside, let's have a chat about colours, how we're going to tackle these units, what we're going to do if we've got more than one unit, which I do. I have 2 units of bloodknights, but we're only going to look at one. And what we're going to do is we're going to invert those colour palettes. But what's the colour palette going to be? Well, let's have a chat and look at how we paint them. That's 5 down, we're on to the 6. Bloodknights. Spiky cavalry. That's not that they're not great models. They are. They look cool, but they are not fun to paint. Well, not for me at least. These things, there's spikes everywhere. And I actually did draw blood putting these together and painting them multiple times. Those lances, seriously, they are going to puncture you one way or the other. I've got 10 of these knights in my list, and what I wanted to do was to have them painted very, very similarly with 2 distinct different ways in mind. Now, as we can look at them, we see there's a lot of armor panels on these. I've approached it in a manner where I've got 2 techniques for painting the armor. One unit of them is going to use one technique for the rider and one for the horse. Inversely, the second unit is going to swap those around. Both of those techniques have very similar start points. With that in mind, what we need to do is prep the armor in the first instance. As always, I'm going to start with a zenithal highlight over a black base colour. Make sure you completely cover your model in black paint. I use rattle cans to do that, but you can use a brush or an airbrush, whatever you like, and then hit the model from above with either a very light grey or a white, and that's going to give you a nice starting point to work from. The first thing we want to do is to re-establish the blacks of the armour. We'll have lost some of this in the previous step with the zenithal. I'm going to use a thinned down contrast paint, but you can use a black wash, and what we're going to do is glaze the entire model. We can do this in a couple of layers, and I would recommend you do so, starting off in the centre of the panel and then moving the brush towards the recesses and lifting off there. Over a couple of layers, what that will do is maintain the zenithal, so we have a brighter spot in the middle of the armour panel, the higher point, and it'll really reinforce the darkness of the shadows and make the armour look black again, while still giving it definition. That's going to be the unifying base for the 2 different techniques we're going to use on the armors. Firstly, we're going to look at the dry brushing technique. Now, this is a very simple technique, but there's a couple of tips that I can give you that will make it even better for you. Even though it's called dry brushing, you want the tips of your bristles to be a little bit damp, only slightly. Wet a paper towel or something and just lightly touch your brush against it. You don't want it wet by any means, it just needs a slight amount of moisture. And what that's going to do is help the paint flow from the brush onto the model. It'll avoid that chalkiness and clumping that you sometimes get. And we need to make sure that the tips of the bristles are always damp throughout this entire process. With that in mind, you'll notice that I'm using a round brush. It doesn't matter what shape of brush is. Don't let any of the marketing say otherwise. I just prefer these round brushes, but you can use whatever you want. Cheap makeup brushes are fantastic for this. Just make sure the bristles are a little bit stiff. Colour-wise, I'm going for a deep red. The brand doesn't matter, the specific shade doesn't matter, just a dark red. Working very, very lightly, I'm hardly touching the model when I do this. Work from top down, catching the light edge parts of the armour, just the sharpest points, You don't want to get too much on the model. So working light, it's like a whisper over a mountain. Just catch all of it, working top down. I can't emphasize that enough. If something's completely in a crevice, don't worry about painting it because it's not going to show. Just let the brush find the high point and work that really slowly and gently. Much like in the previous step, we're going to do exactly the same thing, but a little bit more selectively in this step. I'm going to go up a couple of shades and use a medium red. You want to make the jump noticeable enough unless you're going to have more steps than we're going to do. Now we're going to do 3 layers of dry brushing. You can do as many as you want and that will make the effect more subtle. 3 is more than enough for gaming pieces, I find. Load your brush up, get some of the paint on there and work it off on your palette, making sure the bristles are still moist. If you've got a palette, I would 100% recommend you use that rather than using a tissue. Using a tissue is going to draw too much of the moisture out of the bristles and out of the paint, and that's where you end up with that chalky, clumpy finish to your models. And we're going to work again from the top down, more selectively this time though, so we're not going to go too far into the recesses. Go even lighter than you did before. Multiple passes to build up the colour. Work slowly, and once you've done that, we'll get on to the next step. In this step, if you do have a smaller brush, it might be worth swapping it to that. It's entirely optional, it's up to you. And we're going to do, again, exactly the same thing as we've done in the previous 2 steps, but we are going to be super selective on where we apply the highlights this time. We want to make sure that we're getting the very tips of that armour, the brightest points. If you think of it in thirds, the entire thing would have been done in the first step. In the second step, with the medium red, we'd have concentrated just on the upper 2/3 of the armour. And in this, the last step, we're going to concentrate on just the very tip, that last 1/3. Making sure that you're working slowly and selectively. Gentle, remember guys. Go as light as you can and build up the colour over multiple passes. It won't take much longer. Trust me, it's much easier to put colour on than to take colour off in areas you didn't want it. I'm using a very bright red here. I could have gone a layer higher, but that would have then detracted from the actual red finish of the armour and taking it more into the orange tone. As armour is such a huge part of this model, having an efficient way of getting the armour painted fast and looking great is really important to getting these done efficiently. All that you've got left to do now is paint the other details on the model. Check out some of the previous videos if you want to look at the techniques that I've used. But for the most part, since the armour is such a huge part of this model, it shouldn't take you too long to get this done. Base it like the rest of your army and you should be good to go. Let's have a look then at the next method. And you could even use one method on the armour of the rider and one method on the armour of the horse. That's what I've done. Let's take a quick look at stippling then. I will be covering this technique in detail in a future video, but for now, let's talk about a few key elements. You will need a stiff bristled brush for this ideally. Can't use your standard paintbrushes. So something like the round brushes I used for dry brushing, a small makeup brush with ideally stiffer bristles will be really beneficial here. And what we want to do is tap the model lightly and let the bristles find the high points. Now again, lightness is key here. Still making sure the bristles are a little bit damp and moist will help the paint flow off the model. We're going to use the same 3 colours we used in the dry brushing step. In this first step then, I'm using a reasonable sized brush and I'm just going to lightly tap it over the armour. I'm not going to push it too hard because I don't want the bristles to find the deep recesses of the armour. I just want to find the higher points of it. You want to work in volumes, so the part that's facing the light source, and since we did the zenithal, that's going to be directly above us in this case. Work slowly, an armour panel at the time, tapping the brush ever so gently. If you feel the bristles splaying, you're putting on a little bit too much pressure, pull back a little. You want to work over the entire model like this, from a 45-degree angle really, so in upwards direction because that's where the light would be coming from, and just work slowly and methodically. Try and be as neat as possible so you're not getting any paint on the surrounding areas. Once you've done that, we can move up to the next colour. We're going to do exactly as we did in the previous step. If you've got a smaller brush, you may want to swap out to that so you can be a little bit more focused. Now thinking of the areas as thirds, we're going to concentrate on the upper 2/3 this time, the centres. You want the previous layer to be showing, concentrate it a little bit further in and you'll get a nice blend between the deep red and the medium red. Much like with dry brushing, if you want to add additional steps to this, you can do. So rather than jumping up several shades, you could go one shade lighter, etc. to the nth degree and get a really subtle blend should you want to. However, I like this more weathered look of having only a couple of colours. Now, concentrate towards the tips of any sharp points as well, much like we did with the dry brushing step. Touching it ever so lightly, try not to have those bristles splay too much, just continue to work slowly and methodically, a panel at a time. We're going to do exactly the same thing as we've done in the previous two steps, but we're going to focus on that last 1/3 of the area, the highest points, the center of the panels. We're going to use our brightest red in this step. And if you've got a smaller brush that you can use, then do feel free to swap it out for that. Just make sure the bristles are nice and moist. Again, working one panel at a time. You want the previous two layers to be showing, as you can see in the diagram, work towards any sharp points that you've got. That black still reading as a deep black with the red high points on there. The armor will look quite rustic and weathered at this point, and that's exactly what we want. You can, if you want, come back afterwards, much like with the dry brushing, and put a unifying wash over the entire model just to tie it all together. A black would work really, really well for this and just bring it to that grim dark look that we want. And as with the previous technique, you should be in a position now where the majority of the model is finished. There's a lot of armor on this model, like I say. So using one technique on the rider and one technique on the horse is going to give you a nice visual differentiation between the two, while still having full red looking armor over a black base. Finish the details, be as neat as you can. Check out the previous videos if you've not, to have some ideas on how you might want to do that and the techniques you could use. But with that, let's take a look at what we've got. We're done. Well done. I didn't enjoy painting those, but I think you'll agree they came out really rather well. Much better than I was expecting. I wasn't thinking that I was going to be able to get quite the look that I wanted, but they did turn out really well. For me, at least. We're going to leave it there for today. I'll see you next time. Hope you had fun. Have a good one.